Today's speaker, Katja, achieved her MA and her PhD from Stanford in economics, and she received her BA and MA from Cologne University in Germany. She is a highly awarded economist, and for example, received from the Center for Economic Studies the Distinguished Affiliate Award for the Economics of Education, which she received in 2010. Her work and interests focus on development and labor economics, applied economics, and economics of education and gender. She has taught courses in nearly all of those arenas, and we're so pleased that she's sharing her work with us today. She's happy to take questions during her talk, so feel free to ask for points of clarity or questions about method and content as the talk goes along. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here, both as a WAPPP Research Fellow and here in the seminar. I very much look forward to all your comments and suggestions, so as was just said, don't hesitate to interrupt me at any point. Today I'm going to talk about a paper on educational choices and subjective expectations of returns to schooling, where we want to provide some evidence on kind of intra-household decision-making and gender differences in this type of process. And this is joint work with Orazio Atanasio from UCL. The goal of this project is to improve our understanding of educational decisions in two main dimensions. First, we want to address the question, what are kind of the main determinants of schooling decisions? And are there differences between boys and girls in these type of determinants? And we're particularly interested in this context in the role of people's expectations about monetary returns, about people's perceptions about unemployment and earnings risk that is related to different types of schooling levels. And also we're interested in kind of the role of marriage market returns. The second question that we want to address in this paper is also, how do different family members decide about the schooling of their children? And in particular, we are interested in whether children play a role in this type of decision-making process, and how this depends on the age and also the gender of the child. Okay. Now, we want to address these two questions in a very specific context, and that is, we are looking at urban Mexico, and we look at two important schooling decisions. That is, one decision is to enroll in high school or not, and secondly, whether people decide to enroll in college or not. Let me briefly relate our paper to the existing literature. First, with respect to the first question on determinants of schooling, as probably all of you know, there's a very large literature on kind of exposed returns to schooling. So there are many papers that study what's the effect of the causal effect of schooling on earnings outcomes, for example. There is much less evidence on the role of kind of non-monetary returns. Okay, and let me kind of point you to three examples that are related. So one paper by Aureopoulos looks at kind of the probability of getting married, how this is affected by having different schooling degrees. Another interesting paper provides kind of descriptive evidence that, in particular, for American women in the 50s and 60s, a lot of nearly half of the return to college came actually in the form of a higher earning spouse. Okay, so here this is just descriptive, so no kind of causal relationship involved. While this very recent paper by Jean Lafortune kind of tries to look at a similar question that we want to look at, in how far are marriage market returns important for people's decision to continue on to schooling. Another related paper is by Zafar, who's also interested in kind of gender differences in determinants of schooling, but he's particularly looking at college major choices, and in particular having a sample of Northwestern students who decide about their college major. Now, compared to this type of literature, so in particular compared to the kind of literature that looks at ex-post effect of schooling on people's earnings, we want to kind of take a step back, and we want to see instead in how far do people's ex-ante beliefs about returns affect their decision to go. Okay, not ex-post, what are the returns, but kind of ex-ante, in how far do people's beliefs affect the decision to go to schooling. And there we want to kind of extend the analysis from just looking at kind of monetary returns to include also kind of people's perceptions about riskiness, like unemployment risk and earnings risk that is related to different schooling levels. And thirdly, we want to provide some further evidence on kind of the role of marriage market returns in the two types of schooling decisions that I mentioned before. Now, concerning the second question of intra-household decision making, as most of you know, there's also quite a bit of literature on this process of household decision making, but most of this literature kind of concentrates on the decision making process between husband and wife, and not so much on the role of children. Okay, in most of these papers, children are basically looked at as public goods or taken into account by caring preferences of the parents, but it's not that children have an independent role in these type of papers. There's just one exception by Dauphin et al., and he's using kind of a structural model to provide some evidence on the role of children. And he can kind of look at a very specific subset of families with three people, 2 parents, 1 kid. They can say kind of what's the minimum number of decision makers in this household. But he cannot specifically kind of say who is the person who is involved in the decision making process. While we are suggesting a very different approach that relies basically on a kind of a new type of survey data that people have started using, and that is we're using data on people's subjective expectations of returns to schooling, and then we want to analyze in how far parents' expectations are important for the decision of the child to go to school, or whether kind of children's own expectations matter as well for this type of decision. And this will help us kind of understand a bit better, what's the decision-making process that's going on in the household. Okay. Now, there's kind of a growing literature using data on subjective expectations. In particular, I would say in developing countries, and I'm going to talk more about this later on in the talk. But because probably for many of you this type of data is new, let me tell you a little bit about why I think this data is particularly useful in the context and for the specific question that we want to address here. Firstly, as I said, this data allows us to elicit people's ex-ante beliefs about returns given the information that people have when making this schooling decision. Okay. And this is an advantage because it helps to relax pretty strong assumptions that are used in kind of conventional approaches. These type of conventional approaches usually use actual earnings realizations of people. So for example, someone decides to go to college, then you follow this person and you know what he's earning actually, with a college degree. Now, in order to use this sort of earnings realization, you need to make a couple of assumptions, right? So one assumption is that people have perfect foresight. So when they were deciding about college, they already knew that this is what they would earn. Secondly, you're still lacking kind of the counterfactual, right? You don't know what this person would have earned if he had not gone to college, and so you need to make some assumptions also about this counterfactual state. And we are asking people about all these different hypothetical scenarios of schooling, and so we don't face this same type of problem. We also don't have to assume perfect foresight because we ask people specifically, given the information you have now, what do you think you could earn with a college degree? What do you think you could earn with a high school degree, and so on. But I'm going to tell you exactly kind of the way we ask these type of questions. Now, why is this so important for these two type of questions that we want to address? Well, for these two type of questions, it's pretty important to allow for heterogeneity in people's information sets. Okay, so for example, we're going to show that there are pretty important differences between what parents expect their children to earn later on and what children expect to earn themselves. Okay, there are some differences there, and it would be pretty hard to kind of accommodate this, in the type of conventional approaches, right? When you use actual earnings realizations, you would have to make some ad hoc assumptions about how and if children and parents differ in what they know about later earnings. While this type of data helps us to learn a bit more, about these differences potential differences in information sets. And secondly, given the kind of context that we're also interested in gender differences, it might be that there are also kind of differences in information sets between boys and girls, right? So for example, in particular in Mexico, where labor force participation used to be pretty low for women, it might be harder for girls to understand, what kind of earning they could have with different schooling levels, given that there are just fewer women out there, who have jobs with a college degree, for example. While boys, might have many more kind of role models and might have a better idea for this reason. And so this type of data kind of allows us to address these issues and look at these issues. And a third and last reason is that this data also allows us to understand the role of people's risk perceptions. So we ask them specifically, or we allow them to express kind of uncertainty about what they might be earning later on. And this helps us because usually when people try to kind of look at the importance of riskiness or uncertainty, unless you ask them directly, you can just use kind of a distribution of earnings that you observe, but then you're kind of mixing actual risk with actual unobserved heterogeneity between people, right? People might have different earnings because they're different, or because they had different kind of shocks. And so to kind of disentangle these two, we kind of try to ask people directly.
Actually, I wonder if there's a way to, I don't know if in your data you can do this, but to track these people over time and to see what their actual earnings are and compare how big of a mistake or overconfidence, a measure of overconfidence.
Right. So, so this survey was done in 2005 for people who were 15 and 18. I'm going to talk about this more later on. But this means that we would observe them in the labor market basically in like 2 years or 5 years. So they are not yet there, where we could observe their actual earnings. So so we were hoping to be able to follow them to do exactly that. Probably we're not able to do that because it's very hard to follow these people for like 7 years or 10 years and find enough of them still. What I'm going to do is show you how these expectations compare to actual earnings data. So not of exactly the same person, but kind of on average to show you that, how the expectations compare to actual
like
earnings.
people with the same kind of characteristics.
Exactly. So we'll do some work there, okay? Okay, perfect. So as I said, there is also a growing literature using this type of data. The kind of seminal paper was by Dominitz and Mansky in '96, who basically was the first to ask students about their earnings expectations, and she shows that in his sample, students are willing and able to answer this sort of probabilistic question. Okay, but he doesn't go further. He doesn't do the additional step to look at the link between expectations and actual schooling decisions. And this is what a couple of recent papers has done. So, for example, Rob Jensen has a very nice paper where he basically asked 8th graders in the Dominican Republic about their earnings expectations. He finds that on average they really underestimate the returns to schooling, and then he informs kind of a random subset of them that, look, really the returns are much higher, right? And then he finds that this random subset really responds to this new information and gets much more schooling than kind of the control group. Right? So he shows in a very nice way this sort of causal link between expectations and actual schooling decisions. And Trong has a related paper doing something similar. In a different paper, I'm using the same data as in this paper, and I'm interested in a kind of very different question, and that is kind of what explains the huge differences in college enrollment between poor and rich people. Okay, and there I'm interested in whether kind of the poor people just don't have enough information, and maybe they just underestimate the returns to college, right? So and maybe this explains their low attendance and not really credit constraints or other things. And so that's kind of what I'm going into in more detail in this paper. Okay. let me kind of briefly preview the results, and then I'll walk you through kind of the data and kind of the analysis that I'm going to do. So what we find here in this paper is that for the Mexicans that we survey who decide about high school and college, we find that this data on subjective expectations of returns really helps to predict their schooling decisions. Okay, so it helps us, in addition to all the usual variables that we're interested in, it helps us to understand who is going to school and why. Secondly, we find that the evidence suggests that boys and girls do differ in kind of the most important determinants of going to school, where boys seem to care more about pure monetary returns, while marriage market considerations seem to be playing an important role for girls in this context. And I'll be more specific about what kind of marriage market considerations I'm talking about. And kind of interestingly, we find that also parents that parents actually care more about perceived risks than the children. Okay, the boys are just interested in pure returns, and the parents really care about unemployment risk, for example, and they send their kids to school if they think that with a college degree unemployment risk is much lower.
I have another question, actually, about your first bullet point. I mean, so could it be self-fulfilling? Because basically, if I already made a decision to go to school, I might think that I'll have a higher expected return from that, so therefore I report a higher, belief about my.
And so you're going to school. So
if I already said to myself, like, I'm gonna go to college, then
for what reason? For what reason?
It's some sort of. History. My friends are going. I don't know, for some societal, let's say, peer pressure, whatever. And so then basically I want to validate my own decision to go to college, and so I report that there's a higher expected earning from it. I don't know if there's
right. So let me give you kind of three types of answers to this question, which is a question that we get regularly. So I think Jensen, for example, is one person who shows in his paper very nicely that it's not just this sort of rationalization. Yeah. So it's not just I go to college because I like college, and then I feel like I should say that returns are high. That's why I'm going. Okay. So this paper where he does this sort of information shock, really shows that there is this causal link from expectations to schooling decisions. That's one thing. So we don't have this sort of experiment here. So we don't have this sort of information shock. Now, first of all. I'm going to tell you about the sample that we have. The sample we have here are relatively poor families, oportunidades families. And I can show you in the paper, we can talk more about this later on. For these families, this is really a big investment decision. So it's very costly for them to go to college. And so while maybe your argument, we might be more worried about your argument in the US where, certain people just go to college because their friends go, etc., right? And because of the consumption value to college. Here, it's very unlikely that, the parents would let their kids go to college just for consumption value. So it's really a big investment decision that families are doing here. So it's not the norm, basically, I guess. Exactly. So for them, it's not the norm. So for them, college is actually, only about a quarter or so go to college. So it's not the norm. The last thing, and this is something we can discuss in the discussion where we specifically look at this point of ex post rationalization. So we have a way of kind of comparing different cohorts, and then I will show you some evidence that makes us pretty confident that it's not this sort of I rationalize what I did later on, but it's really inherently the returns that are important. Okay.
Do you incentivize subjects to give their best estimate? Because then I think it would also be reduced this rationalization effect.
So depending on what you would ask them, I think that would be a good idea. Here it's very hard, to give the incentive to
well, if you have the data on the average.
But how do you give an incentive to truthfully report what you're doing, right? It's very hard. So one thing that I can show, if for example, let's say the social norm is you should be going to college, or returns are important for going to college. So basically people, just say what they think is according to the norm.
In that case, I agree.
Then I wouldn't see this sort of, then I wouldn't get the pattern that we see. So that's why I'm less worried about this, and we can talk about this more. I think in some contexts where you say, look, you get a prize if you're very close to the true value, right? Then it's a perfect thing to incentivize. Right. Here, you can't do that, right? So here we ask them, what would you earn in 10 years if you went to college? What would you earn in 10 years if you didn't go to college? There's no way to actually, to compare this to what actually happens in 10 years.
No, not exactly, but you could give on average, you could be correct. So
that's, but there's no reason why this specific person should exactly have the return that the average person has. So there are good reasons.
Right, so it would not be a complete incentivization, yes.
So there are good reasons, and I'm going to show you why a specific person, right? He knows that his parents have good connections, so he will get a good job with college, right? So he might expect more than the average person, but he has a good reason for that. Yes. So that's why it's it's tricky. So, but we can talk more about this later.
When the experiment informs people about the returns to college, does it mean returns to the college degree? Because each year of college has a different increment if you don't get the college degree.
Right.
And many low-income people don't get the degree.
Don't manage.
They put the investment in and they only get the years.
Right.
They don't get the degree. So the risk is higher for those. So when you inform people about return to what we call college, are you referring to the degree?
So, as I said, we don't do this sort of information treatment. So these two papers do this type of treatment.
And did they refer to the degree?
And I think they refer to the degree. So they say basically if you.
So they're misleading
right.
for low-income subjects.
So that's. So I wouldn't put it this way, but
they're saying it's degree, but they're implying that you should go to college.
They're giving them factual information.
They're giving factual information about the degree. They're not giving factual information about the percentage of people who don't get the degree from their income bracket.
They're not telling them anything about that.
This is about high schooling. The Jensen paper.
So a Jensen is about it's 8th graders exactly who continue in high school. Yeah, that's right. So it's not about college actually. It's. I think there you could have a similar issue. Maybe they manage to get to 9th grade, but they don't manage to to finish high school. So I think. That's why, I think it's a tricky issue. And, I agree that they give factual information, right? But I don't want to go too much into this because, there's a big debate about, whether to do this or not. So, so we can talk more about this later on. Concerning the second point, the intra-household decision process, I think there are some very interesting results here where basically we find that mothers are always involved in the decision of girls to go to high school or to go to college. Okay, so they're always involved and their expectations matter. This is not true for boys. Okay, and for boys in particular, in households without any father, so basically just a single mother and then their son and possibly daughter or not, the sons are really deciding themselves. So even for the high school decision where we have like a 15-year-old boy, he's really making the decision by himself, and the mother does not seem to be involved in this type of decision, which is not true for girls. So there seems to be some important differences here. So let me move on to kind of the data description, tell you exactly what are the questions that we're asking. And then I'll show you a little bit how expectations compare to actual data and, to kind of give you a feel about how well informed people are about their expected earnings. And then I'll show you briefly kind of the simple reduced form model of schooling choice that we have and the empirical results. Okay. So the data that we're using is from an evaluation survey called Jóvenes con Oportunidades. It's data on 23,000 adolescents between grade 9 and 12 and their siblings. So the main sampling units are people in grade 9, 10, 11, 12, plus the whole family was sampled in addition. Now, given kind of the administrative structure of this survey, all the families are Oportunidades beneficiaries. Okay, so they have been receiving money for their kids in earlier years, and this implies that we don't have a representative Mexican sample, but we basically have around the poorest third of the population or so. And the information, we have pretty extensive information on schooling and individual and family background characteristics. I'll show you this information later on. But let's focus first on kind of the module on subjective expectations of earnings. Okay, so just to tell you about the structure in which we ask these questions, first, for those who just graduated from junior high school and who decide about senior high school, we ask them about the expectations for 3 different schooling scenarios. Okay, we ask them, imagine that you stop school now, so you have a junior high school degree, what would you earn later on? Imagine that you continued to senior high school and finished that, what would you be earning later on? And imagine you continued on to college as well, what would you be earning? Okay, and secondly, for the second older cohort who decide about college, we ask them about the 2 relevant schooling scenarios. Imagine you stop school now and imagine you continued on to college. Okay, now what are the specific type of questions that we're asking? First, we ask them about the perceived probability of having a job with these different schooling degrees. So we ask them, for example, assume that high school is your highest schooling degree. From 0 to 100, how certain are you that you will be working at the age of 25? That's the first question. And then conditional on having a job, so assume that you have a job at age 25, and assume again that high school is your highest schooling degree. What is the maximum amount of earnings that you can have at age 25? What's the minimum amount of earnings, given that you have a job? And from 0 to 100, how certain are you that your earnings will be at least the midpoint? And the midpoint is something that the interviewer computes from the maximum and the minimum. Okay? And just to give you kind of a graphical illustration, so basically the pieces of information that we know is what's kind of the minimum earnings. So for each schooling scenario, we know kind of the minimum earnings, the maximum earnings, and then the probability above the midpoint, okay, where these 2 probabilities add up to 1. Okay. Now, obviously from this information, we need one additional assumption to kind of compute moments of this distribution. Okay. So remember, we have this for each individual, and for each individual we have this for all 2 or 3 different schooling scenarios. And then with this type of information, given the distributional assumption, we can compute moments. So we know what are the expected earnings, what's the variance of earnings, and so on. Okay, so we're using kind of these 2 extreme distributional assumptions, and always run all the results, trying both to make sure that the results are robust to this assumption. And using this form, so for example, this triangular distribution, you can then compute very easily the expected earnings, the earnings risk, that is the variance, and we use the question on the probability of earning.
So for the question of probability of working, I would imagine that it's not 100% the right question, right, for the expected, because basically the right question would be, what's the probability that you could be working at age 25? Because especially for a woman, preferences come in, right? So you could be married, and at 25 you're thinking, well, I'll be married, I probably won't be working, but if I wasn't married, I could be working.
That's true, but on some level, for the decision to go to college, right? It's kind of an interaction of the 2. So you have in your mind also kind of, the likelihood that I will be married is, I don't know, 70%, and then I will not be working, and the likelihood to not be married is 30%, then I will be working. So this is kind of the calculation after that. So
you could back it out in a way.
If we had asked them also exactly
marriage question,
also the marriage question, we could kind of back this out. So I think this would be interesting. I still think that the way we ask this is helpful for us to understand why they choose in this way, because it's kind of combining what they know about themselves, right, and what they believe about. If I have a college degree, then I find a husband with 60% likelihood, and then I will be working or not, right? So it's kind of a calculation after that. So basically, and that's kind of the relevant thing we want to know to understand later on. While I agree, it would be interesting to also ask kind of this marriage question in addition, which is something that we've been doing, in some way in kind of a more recent survey to try to get at this a little bit more. Okay. So let me show you a little bit about this type of data, about how well people are informed about potential earnings. I show you how and if mothers and youth expectations differ. I show you a bit more about how expectations vary with individual and family background characteristics. And we are, of course, interested in kind of differences for boys and girls in these two questions. Okay? And someone was asking about kind of the level. Let me show you this kind of briefly. Okay, no, this didn't work. Okay, so just to, as I said, we don't have the actual earnings of these people yet because they're only in the labor market, they're only 25 in 2012 or 15. Let me compare this to kind of average earning in the census. Okay, so for example here, in the first line we have, for the older cohort, we have expected senior high school earnings. And then here below we have kind of the actual census earnings that people have with the senior high school degree. Okay? And if you compare this, you see that people are, at least relatively similar to the actual earnings. Okay, so they are at least in the ballpark, and as I said, people can deviate from this, because of better information or because of, being underestimating or overestimating. But at least the ballpark is fine specifically for the older cohort and for the parents. If you look at the younger cohorts, you see that the adolescents themselves are much more off. So there it seems that the adolescents really underestimate what you can earn, while the parents, again, or the mother is much closer to actual earnings, while both boys and girls who are 15 years old, they seem to have kind of less of a clue what people can earn at that age. Okay. Kind of tricky here. Okay. Now, for the second question, this is also a little bit of a validity check, because imagine, we usually do this with actual earnings, right? We show how actual earnings vary with people's characteristics, kind of a Mincer earnings regression. And if we think that people have a decent idea about the characteristics with which earnings vary, this should also be true for people's expectations, right? So that's kind of a check that we want to see here. For example, do smarter people expect to earn more in the labor market and so on? So let me show you this. Now, the first thing that we're doing here is to kind of compare how do the answers differ when boys respond themselves versus when the mothers are responding. Okay, so the left-hand side here is boys, and these are the expectation questions for the three different schooling scenarios. This is for the young cohort. Okay, and if you see here, we enter a dummy for the youth is responding himself. You see that boys for this young cohort expect to earn significantly less, or sorry, here it's not significant, but they expect to earn less than when the mother is responding. For girls, this is even more so the case. Okay, girls, so 15-year-old girls really think that they will earn much less than what mothers think these girls can earn later on. And if we want to see, what are the things that vary, that expectations vary with, I think one interesting thing is that, for example, if the father is an employer, then you see that boys expect to earn significantly more. Okay, so if their father is an employer, he could employ them directly. Basically, they expect to earn significantly more. For girls, for example, if girls are from a richer family, they expect to earn significantly more. Here, that sign is maybe more surprising. So if the mother is slightly more educated, they think that the earnings are slightly lower for the lowest kind of schooling degree. Okay, so there seems to be something that if the mother is more educated, she thinks that the kid has to get a higher schooling degree to be earning more.
Can you give us a bit of a ballpark, like what does this translate to in terms of actual like magnitudes? Are these big numbers? I mean, I'm not 100%.
You mean in terms of levels, in terms of earnings
maybe
expectations?
just some sort of like example of how does this
in terms of
compare to
differences?
mean, or like what's the means?
So I showed you in this table before. I showed you kind of the mean. So there people were pretty close. So for example. So for example, for a high school degree, I think people expected to earn about 1,600 pesos, and the actual earnings were in this similar ballpark. So they were very similar. If you look here, so this is the differences between what the youth expects and the mother expects. So here the boy expects basically 25% less. Okay, so this is pretty big, and so for the girls it's even larger. Okay, so there the differences are pretty large. Yeah.
So what was your, I missed it maybe, what was your explanation for the negative sign of the effect of father's occupation for girls?
So father's education has a positive
effect?
Employees.
No, if the father's occupation is employer, then girls are less...
Expect to earn less? I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Yeah,
I don't have a good... because it seems
to
be significant.
That is significant, yes. I'm not sure what this is. Yeah. And now, let me say, so this is not about how people form expectations, so this is really purely about correlations, okay? So this data is not very good in kind of understanding better the expectation formation process. This is just to show you some correlations. Here you see there are also differences between mothers and youth for the older cohort, but the differences are smaller. Here for boys they are not significant. For girls they are significant, but only for senior high school. Okay, so for the older cohort, their expectations seem to be kind of converging towards what the parents expect. And here maybe it seems that for this older cohort, the correlations are a bit more in kind of the range that we would be expecting maybe. So here you really see that kind of the smarter kids are expecting to earn more. Okay, or the parents expect the smarter kids to earn more. Richer families, the kids expect to earn more, higher father's education, but again for mother's education this is going in the other direction. So not exactly clear what is going on here. While for father is a family worker, for example, who is working at home in the same family, the expectations are lower for later earnings, right? When you're staying at home to work.
So what would be the? So these are dummies. So what is the standard? What is the standard of father's occupation?
You mean how many?
No, I mean this. Yeah, that was the default. That's what I mean.
The default is worker. So is worker compared to employee, family worker, and employer. Just a regular worker. That's the default. Yes, and family workers is lower. Employee. Again, it's not clear why it's lower. But as I said, I don't want to make too much of this. These are just correlations to kind of get an idea with what these expectations vary. The more important thing is kind of to see, do these expectations help us to predict what is the schooling decision that people are actually taking?
Yeah, I think I have an idea about the higher degree earning girls have lower expectation of earning even when the father is an employer or family worker. Because I think when they have especially a college degree, they probably expect to work somewhere else.
Right.
So they're probably not going to take over the family business.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So they will have to work for someone else.
Right,
then they don't have a guarantee.
Instead of the boy. Yeah,
right,
that's
the
true.
boys will have a guarantee they will be eventually taking over.
Right. So it's It's not entirely clear why it's negative, but I agree there is these differences between boys and girls, which makes sense that the boys expect to take over this business while girls not. Yeah, no, that's true. So let me move on to the kind of model of schooling decisions. As I said, I want to see kind of how does the schooling decision correlate with people's expected returns. Okay, these are rows the expected monetary return with the perceived variance of earnings, with the probability of working, and with kind of a marriage market returns. And I'm going to show you kind of the proxy that we're using for marriage market returns. Okay, so we want to, question?
Sorry, I just was wondering if in this calculation you have any sort of control for the urgency of another earner in the family. So like, does that make sense? Because it seems to me that that would help this huge, especially if the third most poor population in Mexico.
So we have, I'm going to show you exactly the controls we're using. We have pretty good kind of family income data, family wealth data, number of siblings, number of older brothers, etc. So we have pretty good controls for this. So we have this included. Yeah, thanks. So let me show you kind of how we want to get a little bit at this question of if marriage market returns are important. So the two proxies that we're using are kind of simply the sex ratio. So basically simply the ratio of unmarried men to women in kind of the relevant age bracket. So for the younger cohorts, we kind of look at widely defined, look at people between 15 and 30. For the older cohort, we look at people between 18 and 35. We can vary this age bracket. And we look at this sex ratio in the locality of residence. Okay. The second proxy we are using is under the idea that maybe what matters is not only how many available men or women are there who are unmarried in my age range, but also what kind of education level do they have, right? So if I'm a girl and I have already a high school degree, I might want to find a husband, who has at least the same education degree as me. And so we also look at this proxy conditional on kind of the education level that that men and women have.
So this assumes that girls will not get education if the chance that they find a partner who also has education is low.
So I told you the story. So I was just going to come to that.
Okay.
So let's say there's a girl who is 15 years old. Okay, she's in her locality of residence, and she's deciding about continuing on to senior high school. Okay. Now senior high school in most cases is not in the locality where these people are, but they have to get somewhere else. Okay, for sure for college this is the case, that people have to leave their locality and go somewhere else. Now, the decision might be, this is our kind of hypothesis, that if there are very few available men in the locality of where I live, okay, basically the only way to meet more men, okay, who are available, or to meet more educated men who are available, is to kind of leave this locality. Okay, now. In this context, there's a very strong social norm in Mexico that unmarried girls would not be let, alone to kind of move to a bigger city and work by themselves and find a guy there. Okay, so their parents would be very reluctant to have this, while instead, if the girl kind of, continues to get more schooling, so she continues to senior high school or to move to college, live with roommates there, that would be more acceptable. Okay, so this means that basically for girls, there's kind of this strong link that basically if there are few marriage opportunities where she lives, basically one way or probably the only option to increase her chances is to kind of leave the locality by getting more schooling. So there's kind of a strong link between this sort of schooling and marriage market possibilities, which is not so much true for boys. Okay, so what I'm investigating here is if this specific story is true. In the end, when I find that for boys this is not true, this doesn't mean that boys don't care about kind of marriage market prospects, but it means that for boys this link is not so much there. Okay, so boys could just migrate to a bigger city, work there, and find a woman there without having to go use this sort of schooling channel. Okay. And so that's something we want to investigate there. Is there this sort of additional push factor that, if I have few available men in my locality, this is an additional push factor for me to get more schooling, because this could help.
But why does the education of the men matters, or the?
So what I'm saying here is that maybe, as I said, maybe there are actually many guys in my locality who have, a junior high school degree or no education. But maybe I don't care about those, right? Given that I already have a junior high school degree, I want to have a guy who has a sufficient level of education. So that's a test, right? I don't know exactly which one is the right one. It could be one or the other, and that's why we want to investigate.
Did you look at any other narratives?
Narratives, for example?
Meaning other than those two explanations, i.e. I think my work prospects will be larger if I move to this area because there's a greater urban center surrounding it. So I don't move to find a man, I move to increase my ability to locate a broader set of jobs for the degree I'm about to earn.
So we would be hoping that this would be included here in these expectation questions. Okay, because in this expectation question, these people know that, okay, if I continue on to college, I am going to leave my hometown, I'm going to go to a bigger city where there is a college, and this implies better earnings possibilities, right? So that would be kind of included in this thought process, right? So in this sense, we would be hoping to pick this up in these questions about expected earnings, right? Because people would say, okay, if I go to college, then I live in this big city, and there my earnings opportunities are better. And then they tell me that, expected college earnings are high. So we would kind of capture that, right? So we would be kind of controlling for that through this expectation data, and hoping that this is kind of, on top of these other considerations.
Yeah, I'm just a bit worried, I'm not sure, but I have this intuition that the second proxy might be endogenous. For example, consider a situation where a lot of men go out to attend school, so there will be very few men around with a high school degree, so therefore females might be more likely to go out, but it may also be the case that in their particular area, people are just very likely to go and attend school somewhere else.
So that's why we're using both, and I can see you worry with this one. Right?
But you're including them both. So
I look at both, exactly. I'll show you, exactly. I look at both. And I'll show you that also if you're more happy with this one, we find an effect just with the first one. Okay, I can see your point there. As I said, I mean, this is not, it's not an experiment, it's basically a correlation, which we think is kind of a first step to look at this sort of issue, right? But I agree. I mean, there are some, there has to be further research on that. But I think the first proxy is a little bit, less of a worry concerning this type of endogyny. Okay, so let me show you. So I'm moving. First, I'll look a little bit more into the intra-household decision making, and look at whose expectations matter, and then I'll move to kind of the different determinants. So then I include kind of this sort of marriage market proxy as well to kind of get an idea about that. So if you don't like the marriage market proxy, hopefully, there's something in there for you in the first part, so where we don't look at that part yet. So what are the controls that we are including in every regression? So we have pretty extensive information, for example, on the high school GPA, on parent education. Parent education is pretty important GPA as well for going to college. Income is important, in particular for girls, kind of interestingly. And also kind of the occupational status is important. Now, in addition, we kind of use some measures for kind of how costly is it to go to college, right? As we said, these are poor families. For them, it's kind of a costly decision. And so kind of one measure that people have been using to capture costs of college is distance to the closest university. Okay, so we know where everyone lives, and we kind of know what's kind of the closest university around them that they could potentially go to. If it's very close, then they can just stay with their family. Otherwise, they need to kind of get room and board, right? Which makes this much more expensive. And you do see that with greater distance, the likelihood to continue to college is decreasing. Also, if the closest college is pretty expensive, the likelihood is decreasing. But interestingly, this is particularly true for girls. So this is not so much true for boys, but for girls, if the closest college is very expensive, the girl is less likely to go on to this type of college. Okay, now let me jump kind of right into the main analysis. So here we're looking at kind of these three measures of expectations: expected returns to college, probability of working with a senior high school degree, and probability of working with a college degree. Okay. And what would we expect? So we would expect that if people expect high returns to college, they are more likely to continue on to college, right? Which you see is true and significantly so for boys. Okay? For girls, the coefficient is significantly smaller and is not significant itself. Okay? So that's kind of one first result which we were puzzled about, or which we thought was kind of interesting. Now, in order to see kind of whose expectations are the ones that are relevant, let's kind of compare boys' own expectations to the role of mothers' expectations for boys. Okay? And one thing you see is pretty clearly, while expected returns that the boy expects himself is a significant predictor of going on to college, whether the mother expects high returns or not doesn't matter. Okay? So the coefficient is basically 0 in this case. If we look at girls instead, you see that girls' expectations are never significant, while mothers' expectations for their daughters seem to be important. So for example, if the mother thinks that the likelihood to get a job with a college degree is much higher, then the daughter is significantly more likely to continue on to college. Okay? So while the coefficient, again, here in this case is pretty small for girls. So one thing we want to conclude from this is that at least the mother seems to be involved in the decision of the daughter. Okay? So her expectations do play a role for the girl, while mother's expectations do not seem to play a role for the son. Okay? That's kind of the one first thing. Okay. But now, one question that is very important and that you might be asking is, what about father's expectations, right? Now, unfortunately, the ideal survey would be, ask everyone about the expectations about everyone. Unfortunately, we do not have father's expectations about the kids. Okay, and you might be worried, of course, that here the significant coefficient for boys might just be reflecting father's expectations. Right? It could be that the father and boy talk, and in reality, it matters what the father expects in terms of returns and not what the boy expects himself. And so one thing we want to do is we have about a quarter of our sample is basically single mothers. So these are mothers that are widowed, divorced, separated, etc. And we can look at this specific subsample, right? Now, of course, they are not directly comparable to other families. They differ in many ways. The only thing we want to say is that for this specific subsample, we have the data for everyone. So for them, we can learn more. So we don't have this issue of missing expectations for the father. And now, if you look at this specific subsample of families without father in the household, you see that actually the effect becomes even stronger. Okay, so for this specific type of families, if the boy expects high returns to college, then he's much more likely to actually continue on to college, while mother's expectations are not significant for the boy. Okay, so for this specific subsample of no father in the household, it seems to be really the boy who's making the decision. While again, in this subsample, we still see that it seems to be really the mother who is again deciding for her daughter, and not the daughter herself. Okay. So,
but it also seems that only for college the mother's expectations matter for girls, and probably other things are important for high school and.
Oh, here we don't have high school yet.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we don't. I'm moving on to high school now. So this was not for high school. Okay, so this was just for college, and there we saw some differences between boys and girls, in particular in the intra-household decision process. So where mother is really involved in the daughter's decision, but not in their son's decision. Okay, now let me move on quickly to the high school decision, and then show you very quickly the marriage market return. So we have, again, the usual controls for that we used also before, and then we move on to the high school decision. Okay. Now here in this case, and you were kind of right in your prediction. So here in this high school case, neither boys nor girls' expectations seem to matter very much. Okay, so they are all over the place. We saw that in this case also they don't have a very good idea about what the actual earnings can be, and their expectations don't seem to be predicting the choices. Okay, while if we look at mother's expectations for girls, they are important. Okay, so if the mother expects, for example, that the girl is very likely to have a job even with a junior high school degree, then the girl is less likely to continue on to higher degree. If she thinks the probability with a college degree is is very high, the girl is more likely to continue on to senior high school, because this allows her to continue on to college, right? And now here in this case, I also included the risk measures, which were never significant before, so I didn't show them. Here in this case, also the riskiness of earnings seem to matter. Okay, and here in this case, if the mother thinks that senior high school earnings are very risky, then the girl is less likely to continue on to senior high school. Okay? Mm-hmm.
Just out of personal curiosity, both in the last data set you just showed and this one, were you seeing higher squares? Was this actually explaining a large percentage of the variance, or?
You mean these measures?
These variables, yeah.
So you see that the R square, or here in this case, it's estimated with maximum likelihood, right? Because the left-hand side is a dummy variable.
Right.
So here you do see that the likelihood increases, okay, if you include these measures in addition. So you do get a better, more power in predicting what people will do if you include these variables in addition. Okay, so the log likelihood is increasing. In the one without, so I don't remember. So this one here, I think this one is the baseline including, so I don't remember. I can look it up in the paper. Okay, I will show you later on. Yeah.
How different are completion rates between girls and boys?
So completion rates are very similar. So both for senior high school and for college as well, for this cohort. So it used to be very different. If you go back like 10 years ago or so, there were significant differences. That's why for Progressa, for example, there are these different Progressa grants for boys and girls. If you remember, right, to induce girls to get more schooling. But in 2005, the rates were already very similar. Yeah. That's a good point, yes. Okay, now again, we're moving to this distinction between families with father in the household and families without father in the household. One thing you see is that now if there's a father in the household, mother's expectations matter for both boys and girls. If we move on to families without father in the household, and I was kind of surprised about this, here also the 15-year-old boy, his expectations are relevant for the choice, okay, and not mother's expectations. Okay, so here again, if the boy expects higher returns or a higher probability of working with a senior high school degree, he's more likely to continue on, and mother's expectations do not matter in this specific subset of households. Okay, so I'm rushing a bit through this because I'm already. Well, I don't know. I guess we had the discussion in the meantime, right? So, so I'm taking a bit more time. So here in this case, for high school, the situation is a little bit different. So there it seems that, in families with father, youth themselves do not play much of a role. Okay, so it's their parents who seem to be deciding. Mother or father, we don't know because we don't have father's expectations. But it doesn't seem to be very much the youth themselves. Well, again, if we look at families without father, it seems to be that even for the high school decision, it's the boy really who is deciding for himself and not the mother. Okay. So let me now move on to kind of the question: can we learn a bit more, or what's the relevance of kind of marriage market considerations? Does there seem to be a role for kind of marriage market returns? And as I said, there's very little conclusive evidence on this topic. That's why we are hoping that just using this very simple proxy where you can have kind of different types of concerns, it's still interesting to kind of see if there is a correlation between this type of sex ratio that we were discussing and the decision to continue on to college or to high school. Okay, so. Now, note here, I'm moving to a slightly different sample because I don't have census information for each of the localities. Okay, so I'm matching kind of census information on the locality level. I determine the sex ratio on the locality level, and I'm losing about half the observations because for about half the localities I don't have census information. Okay, so I'm moving to a slightly different sample. And interestingly, in this sample of census localities, now girls' expectations are slightly significant on a 10% level, but you still see these big differences between boys and girls coefficient. Okay, so the coefficient is significantly different. Now, if we look at kind of the effect of this, the sex ratio, for girls, we find kind of the expected sign of the coefficient. Okay, so for example, here in this case, imagine there are many unmarried women to men in a locality, right? This means that basically the sex ratio is bad for the woman, right? Few available men, and this means there's kind of a push factor for the girl to leave the locality and continue on to college. And you do see kind of a positive correlation between having few available men and continuing on to college for a girl. For a boy, I entered this proxy in kind of the symmetric way, right? So if for boys this is relevant as well, we would expect kind of a positive coefficient here for boys as well. And for boys, the coefficient is negative here, but not significant. Okay, so for boys, we don't see kind of the same type of effect. Sorry, this was first the sex ratio conditional on education level. Okay, so these were like having many highly educated men in your locality, and now if you prefer this measure, which is hopefully where we have less of a worry that it's endogenous, we just include the pure sex ratio. Okay, just the number of unmarried women to men, and here you see that the effect is actually even stronger. So there is a strong positive correlation between this sort of sex ratio and the likelihood of girls continuing on to college. Okay. Now, just as the last slide, what do we find for high school? So for high school, I do the same thing, and you see a very similar result also for high school. Okay? Also for high school, if there are few available men in the locality, girls are more likely to continuing on to senior high school. For boys, the coefficient here is 0 or even significantly negative. But for sure, in each of these cases, the coefficient is always significantly different for boys and girls. Okay, entered in a symmetric way. So there is a significant difference in kind of the marriage market considerations as a determinant for boys versus girls.
I think that the endogeneity issue is mitigated a bit by the inclusion of fixed effects. Right?
Sorry?
The locality fixed effects.
Ah, okay, yes.
Right? So that's
right.
probably an answer.
Right,
One of the
right.
answers. At least the third, like a meta-variable bias type of consideration.
Yeah.
But the reverse, I mean, yeah.
Right.
So I think that might be the answer.
That helps a bit. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Yes. Okay, perfect. So, yes?
I'm just wondering if there's an alternative storyline instead of the women going to seek men. It's simply that they're not being blocked by the available men to marry. Just not blocked, that sounds negative, but simply like because of the fact that there's not men to marry, it leaves them the chance to go to college. And it's not so much that they're conscientiously think I'm going to go to college to seek out a man, but well, I don't have a man here, so there's nothing stopping me. Why not take this time and go to college?
I'm happy with that. So I can definitely not not say it's one versus the other. I was actually going to say there's even kind of an additional. So I'm happy with that story also. There's one kind of additional story that you could say in addition. I think it's a combination of the two, which is you could say, and I don't know if you like this story, but you could say, okay, either if there's no guy here, then I go out either because I'm not restricted or I'm actively seeking someone. But the other thing is that this is also an insurance for me, right? If I'm moving out and I don't find anyone, right, then I need to kind of insure myself, right? I need to find a job myself, right? Because to care for myself and maybe my parents and so on, right? So that's kind of the alternative, or I think an additional story, which is most likely also true, but it's also related, to marriage market aspects. So in this sense, there are kind of different stories. My main point is that just, marriage market aspects could play a role also in schooling decisions, which I think, and it could potentially be, a pretty important determinant as well. So So what I'm saying is I think, in particular, the economics literature has very much focused on kind of monetary returns. So there's, I don't know how many papers on, monetary returns. And I think, it's kind of unfortunate, or I'm hoping that there will be more research also on kind of, non-monetary aspects. And I think marriage market aspects are one of them, which, might be important. So this is kind of just the first step to kind of suggest that maybe this is something else that we should take into account as well.
But if you marry somebody with a high education, that also has monetary implications.
Sure, that's for sure true. Yes, I agree. Yes, exactly. So that's actually something we're trying in this new survey. So where we ask, kind of, if you continue on to college, what's your likelihood to find someone, right? And if you stop after high school, what's the likelihood to find someone? We also ask kind of, what do you think this person is going to earn? So exactly to capture this sort of, other monetary aspect as well. And I think what I wanted to want you to take away is kind of, I think this sort of data helps us in a nice way to also get a little bit more insight into kind of the intra-household decision process, which is something which is very hard to look at. So there's little evidence, once you move from kind of 2 decision makers to more decision makers, it's very hard to tackle. Okay, and these papers have to kind of assume a lot of structure, model, make parametric constraints, and a very different kind of alternative strategy would be to kind of use this type of data of expectations, and hopefully we can learn a little bit more about this. And here in this context, I have to say I was a little bit surprised. So given that boys and girls have very similar schooling level, I actually didn't start off with expecting very big gender differences here. But then if you talk to Mexicans and you tell them, okay, by now they have a very similar schooling level, but who is actually making this decision, what's exactly going on in the household, is still, you still don't have this sort of gender parity that, probably you have here. Or I actually don't know. People ask me, like, what do you think would be the case in the US or in other countries? I don't know. And I think it would be kind of interesting to, to do this sort of analysis also in other contexts to see if it's similar or if it's very different there. So maybe here the role of daughters and sons is kind of more equal.
And on that note, an interesting piece to look at would be Rob Jensen's paper, which looked at how families are more likely to stop with one child if they have a son, that girls come from households with a larger set of siblings and therefore have a smaller resource pool. So even if there is parity among the children within the household, in the aggregate, girls will still have less resources for their schooling.
Right, so there's another channel, right, exactly. Okay, there are no more questions. Thank you very much for all your feedback.